apologies for being late. We had some last-minute technical glitches here that we had to deal with, all part and parcel with running a complex webinar such as this here. So welcome to the Towing and Recovery webinar, today sponsored by ARA and BCAA. Today's topic is going to be on the upcoming regulations for the electronic login devices and hours of service. So we wanted to host this webinar is because we are starting to get some questions about these upcoming regulations. We didn't really know a whole lot about it. We thought towing's a little bit of a gray area in this matter. It affects some, not others. And I know that you're probably going to have a lot of questions, or if you're just here to gather information to even see if it applies, that'll be great. So I want to start off our webinar here with a few introductions. And then we can get right underway. So I want to start by introducing myself. My name is Ken Hendricks. I'm the Senior Advisor, and I manage the towing portfolio for the Automotive Retailers Association. I'm joined by the editor and publisher of Tow Canada, Eva Kastrankova. She's going to be helping me out, and she's going to be fielding the questions. And she's our producer today. I'm also joined by Dave Welloy. I think most of you know Dave as the former senior manager of the automotive and safety training, and well, he's moved on to much bigger things apparently. He is now currently the manager of ERS, Fleet and Contract Partners. And also I'm joined from the Commercial Vehicle Safety Enforcement. I am joined by Karen Couveret. Now Karen is the manager for the BC National Safety Code program since 2015. And she's been with the CVSE for about 15 years now. And she kind of said a little bit off camera here that really, despite not knowing anything about her car, she absolutely loves working for the commercial motor vehicle industry. So welcome, everybody. Again, a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This session is going to be recorded. Did we lose Eva? I hope not. Okay, I hope we didn't lose Eva so that we have some questions. And hopefully I didn't lose everyone else. Anyways, we'll get started. So this is being recorded. So if you did miss today's webinar, it will be posted on the ARA website and social media. And I'm sure BCA will help us share that as well. Karen is going to begin with an overall presentation. She's tried to gear the information towards the towing and recovery industry to make it as relevant as possible. We're going to allow her to go through the whole presentation. What I'm encouraging you to do is, if you have questions, just make a note of that and then ask that at the end. And I'm hoping that Eva will return and she'll be able to manage some of those questions. On a webinar, you are automatically muted with your cameras off. There will be an option there you see on the lower screen just to raise your hand. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand and Eva can unmute you. If not, she cannot get back in. Okay. Well, as Karen's giving her presentation, I'm going to try and clean this up. If we don't have time for that question period, we'll just post this information out. And Karen, you said there will be a contact that you'll be able to field some of those questions. Okay, so you'll still be able to ask your questions. It may just not be with this webinar. So Karen, if you want to proceed, you can bring up your PowerPoint on screen. Thank you.
You should now be able to see that on screen. It should say electronic logging devices in BC. All right. So I thought as we were starting, I'd give just a quick little how did we get here? Because this is something that's been being talked about in industry for a long time. Quite literally, as Ken mentioned, I started in this role in June of 2015. And the first briefing note I wrote about electronic logging devices was that fall, and it wasn't a new topic at that point. So this timeline really only looks at the last little bit, and we're not going to spend a lot of time here, but it is really to give a sense of exactly how much has been going on to get us to this point. And where we are right now is that as of February 13th, 2023, BC has announced a provincial ELD mandate that basically mirrors the federal ELD mandate, and the regulations for that go into effect as of August 1st, 2023. which then we're going to talk about what that means. But that's where we're at the moment. The federal mandate for electronic logging devices, if you're crossing provincial and territorial borders, is already in place. And now we will have the provincial mandate coming up. So as part of that, because of the scope of the work that we needed to do, we've actually done a full repeal and replace of Division 37 of the Motor Vehicle Act regulations. That was really needed. Much of that division has been in existence since 1990 and has been primarily unchanged, other than the hours of service changes that happened in 2007. And so we've now restructured the division. The changes all come into force as of August 1st, 2023. It makes it meet the current drafting standard. We've updated the language to help make sure there's clarity where there isn't. We've resolved the weird numbering that's in there currently. And really the only substantive change is to bring in the ELD mandate provincially, and to also allow the director of CVSE to potentially provide exemptions in relation to ELDs when it's in the interests of road safety. As part of that project, there were then 3 other orders in council that had to move forward with that to facilitate those changes. The first is about the change to the use of electronic devices while driving regulation. You'll probably know that better as the distracted driving reg. It's not actually its official title, it's the longer version. We'll talk a bit about those. There's also changes to the violation ticket administration and fines regulation, which is what sets the fines when a violation ticket is issued. And there is a tiny change to the motor vehicle fees regulation, which might be relevant if at some point you need your safety certificate replaced. There used to be a $10 fee to do that, to get a replacement certificate. We haven't actually been charging that fee for ages now because it costs more to process the fee than the fee itself. And so that change has been made, so there's no cost to that. So let's take a look at the different regulations that have changed, so you have an understanding of what's happening with those. The first one we're going to look at is actually the distracted driving regulation. And that one is already in effect. That actually came into effect immediately on February 13th, 2023. And really what that does is make sure that drivers are allowed to use their ELD and not have it considered as being distracted driving under that regulation. It also does allow that new drivers who might be driving commercial motor vehicles that are subject to hours of service and need an electronic logging device can still use that device rather than being precluded from using any electronic device, say like hands-free dialing on their phone, which is not allowed for new drivers. So that may not, it's not a sort of a huge piece, but it does, we have had some questions that have come up on that, and so that's now in place so that free and clear to use the functions that are needed for ELDs, no question about that. So BC's provincial ELD mandate, that's really the piece that's the source for a lot of the questions. The key piece is it's consistent, same as we did in 2007 when our provincial hours of service regulations were updated, and we made it so that it was consistent regardless of where somebody is operating, whether they are only in BC or if they cross provincial or territorial borders. The same is true regarding our ELD mandate. There are some exceptions and some exemptions that we're looking at and going to be issuing in BC, but generally speaking, it mirrors it, and so that it's the same whether a carrier operates only in BC or operates across the country. It is consistent with the current use of paper daily logs. So essentially, if you currently need to use a paper daily log to track your hours of service, you will need an electronic logging device in the future. There are a few exceptions to those, and there are things like the ability to use local time records that still exists, since those are separate from from a daily log. One thing to be aware of, in the new regulation, the word is record of duty status. but essentially that means the same as a daily log currently does. So that comes into effect as of August 1st. There are some limited exemptions, and we will talk a bit about those. They are issued by the director under the director's authority. And any of those exemptions are always about more effectively securing road safety. That's always the authority that our director has in relation to any exemptions, because that is clearly our priority as commercial vehicle safety and enforcement. One thing to note, if you are exempt from using an ELD, you will still have to record using a record of duty status unless you're within the 160 and are then using a local time record. And an exemption from an ELD doesn't mean you're exempt from hours of service, because that's a whole different issue. So one thing I wanted to do, because I know people get used to where to look things up in the division to answer questions about what the requirements are. And since we've restructured it, we're going to take sort of a spin through that. We'll try to do that fairly quickly, and I'll just highlight the things that I think are most useful for you. One of the things I have said to Ken is I will send a copy of this presentation as a PDF so that Ken can share that out to those who are here, because there are some links that may be useful, and then you'll have the information. So part one is still where we find all of the definitions. There's no substantial changes there other than, tweaking things to make for some additional clarity. Part two is a new part in it, and it is something I want to take a moment to highlight because it's a piece that's been in the current regulation in relation to hours of service, and we've pulled it out to make sure it's really clear. This section, this part is now referred to as generally applicable safety requirements, and there is only one section in it. It's what was section 3712 in the current regulations, and it's the one that defines that no carrier, shipper, consignee, or any other person must request, require, or allow a driver to drive, and no driver must drive if, and there's a number of things there, but they all come down to that we don't let drivers drive when it's going to, when it would be likely to jeopardize the health and safety of the public. So, even if somebody's exempt from hours of service, the answer is if they're fatigued, we need to not have them on the road, right? Even in emergency situations, all of those things, because the last thing we want to do is have, if we're working, to recover and to provide support when there's been an accident or collision, we don't want further injuries happening or further accidents happening because the commercial driver involved is fatigued, right? We're all trying to get everybody home safe and sound. And so we've pulled that out to just highlight and make sure it's really clear that it applies regardless of what's going on. Part three talks about basically how you get a safety certificate and safety ratings, all of those kind of things. There aren't any major changes in there. You probably already have your safety certificates, presumably, so not something we're going to spend a lot of time on here. Part four is then the part where all of the hours of service rules are for the basic hours. And we've split out what used to be in part three of the division. It's actually in parts 4 through 8 now, so that we can kind of group them and make it really clear what we're talking about. So part 4 is the general piece. It's all of the same provisions that were there in regards to, 13 hours of driving time, 14 hours on duty, 16 hours of elapsed time. All of those pieces still the same. Those things aren't changing in this. It has been reorganized. So if you're used to looking for the things in a certain order, they are in a little bit of different order, but we've tried to make sure it's sensible in how it reads through, recognizing that it's only some of us, like me, who really actually enjoy reading regulations. So we wanted to try to make it as easy and clear as we could. One of the things that we have done is establish specifically a local driving hours section, rather than it just being part of the record keeping requirements. And we're going to take a minute and look at that because that's for the driving within 160 kilometers. And I know that's really important to this group because much of the work happens within that radius. The key piece to it is that it simplifies the record keeping because we know that's always been the intent, but the intent was not well met in the current version of that. The other thing to note in there, the ability for the director to issue an exemption for non-passenger vehicles with a licensed gross vehicle weight under 11,795 kilograms. That authority is still there, and that exemption from hours of service will still exist. And if somebody is driving that sort of vehicle and they're always exempt from hours of service, then they are quite obviously exempt from needing to use an ELD because there would be nothing to record. So that doesn't change. There's a little bit of tweaking in the wording, and we will be updating the circular that issues that exemption because it needs to reference the new section numbers, but it's not going anywhere. So let's take a look specifically at the local driving hours piece. So the key part that's still the same, exactly the same, is that it has to be within a radius of 160 kilometers of the home terminal. And that is definitely a radius. It's not the amount of time that you might be on the road and the kilometers traveled. It is a radius. So as the crow flies, regardless of how many twists and turns of the road might be required given some of the geography in our province. And what we've done in this is we've essentially the requirement in the federal reg talks about needing to record on-duty times rather than what's in our current regulation of the start and end time of each duty status, which really meant that people ended up needing to keep a graph grid and then wasn't simplified record keeping. So to allow us, for the carriers to be able to monitor what's happening and for us to be able to enforce when we need to, we have pulled basically all of the requirements if you're operating under within that 160 into this section. It's 3728 in the new regulation. And we've simplified what the requirements are also for the driver so that they don't rely on not driving after a certain requirement, which is how all of the hours of service requirements are written. So if a driver is operating within 160 kilometers of the home terminal, if they are required to take, if they're taking at least 10 hours of off-duty time in a day, so same amount of time as normal, they're required to return to the home terminal each day to take at least 10 consecutive hours of off-duty time before accumulating any additional on-duty time. And that is a slight tweak from what you could currently do because it means you need that full 10 hours in a chunk rather than potentially having, sort of 2 hours that you could split up into half-hour sections throughout the day. And then that there is still the requirement to take at least 24 consecutive hours of off-duty time within the previous 14 days. So that's what the driver has to do. If the driver is doing that, then the carrier's requirements for their records is to maintain the accurate and legible records. That's the same as normal. And this is important. For each day a driver is on duty. So if the driver is off duty, no records are needed to be kept because there wouldn't be anything to record. And you keep them for 6 months, same as you would with any hours of service record. And what the carrier needs to keep in those records are the cycle the driver was following, so whether it's cycle 1 or cycle 2, because cumulative cycles do still apply, the time the driver reports for duty, and the time the driver is released from duty, and the total number of hours the driver is on duty. So from a simplified record keeping piece, it means that, for example, you could potentially add something to the trip inspection reports that are required that has that information, so it's there and recorded and as simple as it possibly could be, and while still allowing all of us to know that we don't have the likelihood of fatigued drivers on the road. Sort of summary piece. So if somebody's operating under the local driving hours, they will be exempt from an ELD. We recognize, though, that sometimes there's the requirement and a need to go outside of 160 for occasional use. Under the federal regulation, there is no flexibility on that, but for us, that didn't seem reasonable. And the towing industry is a good place as an example where, you might have something that, your norm is within 160, but something needs to go further. So in that case, we've defined occasional as being no more than one trip outside 160 kilometers for the current day or previous 14 days. And in that context, a trip, so anything, basically it starts at the home terminal, does the trip and comes back to the home terminal. That's what we're looking at as a definition of a trip. And no more for it to a maximum of 6 days within a 60-day period. So if you have one trip that you do in a day that just, circles, comes back, that's outside the 160, you could potentially do 4 of those in a 60-day period, because you could do one basically every other week. If it's a trip that needs to take longer, you might only be able to do 1 or 2, depending on how many days we're talking. And if that's the case, and that's what's happening, then the driver for those specific trips would use essentially a paper record of duty status, so a paper daily log, to give that flexibility. If it's something where you have operations that need to be outside that 160-kilometer radius more than that, then would default back to needing an ELD, because that's sort of the default requirement for that. So we're going to keep scooting along through Division 37. The next part, Part 5, speaks specifically to ELDs. And if you need to use an ELD, the details of that are here. It does mirror what's in the federal regulations. And there are offenses that are associated with ELDs if they're not being used. It's one of the things that's probably useful to know is that if an ELD is required, it is the carrier's requirement to make sure that the vehicle is equipped with an appropriately mounted ELD, and the carrier's requirement to make sure that they set up a system of accounts that identifies each driver, so they have their own account, and also accounts for unidentified driving, so that that time can be logged appropriately. Also the part that allows the issuance of ELD exemptions. So we've published a list of intended exemptions that's available on our website in the bulletin that we published on February 13th. And there's a link to that bulletin at the end of this slide deck. So that list of intended exemptions, if you're taking a look at it, there is information in there about those within 160 and the occasional use there. That's one of the ones that's on that list. You may notice that it says that any updates will be published to that list prior to August 1st. For clarity, anything that's on that list currently, the director has already signed off on it, and those exemptions will be going forward. But we wanted to recognize that there could be things we need to add to that list. We haven't had anything come in yet that looks like it's actually going to be added, but the reason we did it as a director's exemption was so that we could be responsive to industry, because we do understand this is a substantive change to what industry's been used to. And as we saw today, tech sometimes causes unexpected challenges. And so we've got that in there where we could look at adding those to that list. The reason that we haven't already published the final, these are the exemptions that are being that are in place, is essentially we can't publish that list of exemptions until August 1st, because the director doesn't have the authority to actually issue the exemptions until then. So at the moment, they live in a list of intended exemptions. Part 6 does talk about other forms of records of duty status. And so, for example, if you're exempt from using an ELD, say under the local driving hours, And when you occasionally need to use a record of duty status when you're outside the 160, the requirements are there about what that looks like. They mirror what's already in Division 37. The other thing that they do allow, and we've been quite deliberate about this, is we recognize that if somebody doesn't have to use an ELD, you may still want to use some other electronic method of recording hours of service that's in an app on your phone that doesn't connect to the vehicle, to the ECM. And we're good with that, because let's be honest, it's way easier to read a record of duty status or daily log that's produced using technology than getting the ruler out and drawing your lines on a graph grid. So that still is possible. A lot of the rest of this we're going to go through really quickly on what's restructured. Part 7 is about the possession, distribution, and keeping of the records of duty status, and it is essentially what was there previously. There's some tweaks and reorganization in there as well. It speaks to how records need to be transferred if they're coming from an ELD, and the need to be able to use those methods. But the basic requirements are still the same as they have always, as they've been since 2007. Part 8 talks about hours of service inspections and what's required and being able to produce to the officer at the time of an inspection. Once again, all of the requirements still the same. Still that the driver has to have the current record, plus the current day plus the previous 14 days. But now it speaks to how those things happen electronically if they're using an ELD. Part 9 is down where trip inspections are. Some people have been asking the question about whether we've finally brought in the federal standard on trip inspections. We haven't yet, but we do have better numbering in here now, so that hopefully we won't create more numbering challenges if and when that moves forward. That does require another regulatory change, so that is outside of that requires approvals at a level that I don't know yet whether that will move forward. Part 10 speaks to compliance reviews and audits, mirrors everything that was already there. We then get to part 11, which talks about offenses and what things are violations under that. Part 12 is bills of lading, not something you're going to care about. And then the other thing we've done in the restructuring is that the various schedules that existed in the regulation have now been moved out into that they're now all at the end of the division, as opposed to being sort of scattered throughout to make it easier to find. So that's what's happening in Division 37. We have, as I mentioned, we have also made updates to the violation ticket administration and fines regulation. It's not one that you'll look at very often, likely, unless you're really curious to know what the fine amount is. The changes there basically just make sure that all the section numbers are updated, because every section number in the division has changed, with the exception of 3701, where the definitions are. There are some places where we have increased the fines in relation to hours of service issues, where we felt that the fine wasn't reflective of the safety piece. For those who are looking at your carrier profiles, the points in relation to NSC, those points aren't changing for the existing offenses, and we're still working on finalizing what points are for the new offenses, and that'll be published hopefully quite soon. We're getting close. And that brings us pretty close to the end. So as a summary, as of August 1st, all commercial motor vehicles that operate provincially or federally will need an ELD unless they're specifically exempt from ELDs. If they're always exempt from hours of service, so for example, those with a licensed vehicles with a licensed gross vehicle weight of under 11,795 kilograms and that are non-passenger vehicles, or if they're driving and operating under the local driving hours that we talked about. This does include, for who will be needing to use ELD, non-passenger commercial vehicles that are licensed with a GVW over 11,794 kilograms, vehicles that are licensed under Passenger Transportation Act, buses, so anything over 10 seating capacity plus the driver, and local drivers who go outside of 160 kilometers, more than what we've defined as occasional use. And then the one you're probably going to care most about for follow-up things is there's the contact information, nsc@gov.bc.ca. That goes to my team, and my team are monitoring that, and then it'll get filtered to whoever of us can best answer the question. The phone number there, that's the main phone number for my team as well. And just to let you know, most of the time, if you call between 8:30 and 3, it will end up going to voicemail. Please leave us a voicemail message. What we do is we triage those so we can make sure the right person is calling you back, and allows us to stay focused on processing the NSC applications, which is the bulk of what my team spend their day doing. But most of the time, you'll have a phone call back within half an hour to an hour at most. If it's something urgent, just make sure you say it's something that it's urgent and time sensitive, and we'll help make sure that gets back. And then there's some links there as well as to where to find the orders and councils. So if you like reading the regs, you can do that. I recommend it. It's fun reading. It's not fun reading. Who am I kidding? It's only me who thinks that. And also the link there to the list of certified ELDs, because that is one of the pieces that an ELD, to meet the regulations, does have to be certified through Transport Canada. There are 86 different devices and models that are currently certified. And if you have questions about what sort of device, I don't know whether, Ken, I don't know whether you guys have sort of taken a look at any of that. Certainly the BC Trucking Association may be able to give some advice. I very specifically cannot, because that's not a place for government to give advice on, who to purchase from in a marketplace. So there we go.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was a lot of information to cover, but it was a very good summary. For myself, and I do read a lot of regulations, I start off with a very, very fuzzy picture, and I find going through them several times, actually, okay, it's starting to become in focus. So I think this will be a useful PowerPoint to distribute, so that you, if you didn't catch everything and you need to review, we will post this on the ARA website. We also have this webinar recorded, and we will post that as well. And then you left the email at the end. So if they have any questions, I can't think of a question right now, they can follow up and email that address, and you can get right back to that answer. We probably wouldn't, Dave, I don't think Dave and I will be the ones to be talking about the ELD devices or anything like that. But as you did mention, BCTA probably does have a lot of good information on that.
They have members who've been using electronic logging devices or their sort of predecessors for years, and
right.
And I know they certainly have collected some feedback from their members. I have very deliberately stayed out of that, because then I can't get myself to oh wait, I just recommended a thing I can't recommend, because
right.
It's not government's place.
Right, and they're probably more the experts anyway, so I would definitely defer any questions about that over to them. I don't know. I'll go to Eva in a minute just to see if there were any follow-up questions. But before, Dave, did you have any questions or anything that you needed to?
Yeah, I know there's a number of questions that I see a lot of the owners on the call. I think that, let them ask the questions, and if there's something that's missed, I can always throw that in.
Okay. Well, we will be able to take a few questions. We do want to be cognizant of time. We had scheduled an hour for this interview. We were a little late, our fault, sorry. So we can go a few minutes over if we have to. But I'll turn over to Eva. And Eva, has any questions come in? I know a lot of absorbing a lot of this information. There's a lot at first. Sometimes questions come later. So which is why you can rewatch the webinar or read through the summary PowerPoint is probably best. But if anything came through.
Yeah, nothing came through, Ken.
Okay.
We have no questions so far, but I just wanted to maybe repeat for everyone that if you have any questions, please just use the Q&A function below, or you can just raise your hand and we will unmute you so you can ask your question.
Right, and I think if you just scroll your mouse down to the bottom, you'll see a raise hand. You should see that, and then you can always raise your hand. Sometimes it's easier just to voice out a question than to write it out.
Absolutely.
One thing I would just add in that, I know oftentimes people are kind of like, oh, I don't know whether we want to ask CVSE questions. They're going to target us and come at. We're not. That's not how we approach things. And this is something I pretty much tell industry every time I have the opportunity to speak to industry. From my perspective, if you're calling us and emailing us to ask questions, you're ahead of the game because you know there's something you need to know. And most of the time, it is really obvious about whether somebody's calling to ask a question or emailing to ask a question because they're trying to comply, or if they're trying to figure out an answer so they can get around compliance.
Right.
If it's obvious that you're trying to get around compliance, that might make the NSC manager curious about what's going on. It's not particularly good for people, but when you're trying to figure out how to do this and to comply, literally that helps. That makes my day, because if you're asking the questions, then you have the ability to learn what it is you need to know so that we all stay safe.
Right. And when you were talking about
I'm sorry. No, I just wanted to say that, Karen, you just encouraged our attendees to raise some questions. So we do have some.
We really are not
Let's go. Let's go to them.
So Michael is asking if 10 hours apply to consecutive per day or total. 10 hours consecutive per day or total.
So if you are operating under the new local driving hours, it does need to be 10 consecutive hours before returning and accumulating more time. If you're operating under sort of the standard hours of service and where you'd be using an ELD, at that point, there's the 8 consecutive hours between work shifts, and you need a total of 10 hours of off-duty time within the day. And that other 2 hours can be split into chunks of 30 minutes or more. So there is that difference if you're operating under the local driving time. The reason for that is because if that time is spread out throughout the day, it gets really tricky for people to monitor and to know, okay, well, wait, who was driving when, if all you're recording is on duty times, which is what's in the federal reg. So that's why we kind of went, okay, we're going to say it has to be 10 consecutive between, so we make sure that people have actually got the rest they need.
Okay.
Thank you, Karen. And there is another question. Paul is asking, if you are on a split shift and then at home, when you are off, does your time keep going?
So at that point, you get into the question of work shift, which is where there's that 16 hours of elapsed time from where you can accumulate your on-duty time and your driving time in a day. If you happen to have, depending on how the splits work, if you have 8 consecutive hours off duty that happens in the middle of the day, that also resets your work shift, right? That's still possible. You still need to make sure that you're within the 13 and 14 hours for driving or on duty in a day, but you do have that ability. Those kind of things, it really comes down to the work shift, and I know that's a place that can be a challenge within the towing industry, particularly in some more remote areas where there might only be one tow truck to go rescue whoever got themselves stuck. Just saying, it was probably somebody like me. See previous comment about not knowing what to do with my car. So, you know, that is a challenge. It is something we've already, Ken and Dave and I were already talking about a little bit to see if there's some conversations we can have, because we know there's challenges. We also know we need to make sure we don't have fatigued drivers on the road, right? That's always kind of our baseline.
Yeah.
Thank
I
you,
would say
Karen.
that's one, if there's specific sort of questions about how does this actually look, please feel free to email me the details. You know, maybe even draw it out on a graph grid, send me a couple of graph grids. You don't have to include names of who the people are, you know, because sometimes looking at that to figure out whether it's compliant, you really need to look at the details on a graph grid. And we're happy to help take a look at those things.
Excellent.
Thank you, Karen. Next question is about how these hours are actually calculated. So is it midnight to midnight, or is it like 24 hours? So for instance, 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. next day.
So the definition of a day in the Motor Vehicle Act regulations in Division 37 is specified. And it's specified as being a 24-hour period that starts at the time specified by the carrier. So the default is people generally use is midnight to midnight, but that's not required. It is possible for you to be using, you know, could be noon to noon, could be 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. That's a carrier decision. One of the things that's probably worth noting, I do know that on the list for certified ELDs, if you're needing to use an ELD, one of the columns on that list talks about whether what the ELD can accommodate. And I think most of them at this point are only accommodating midnight to midnight, just because that's the majority of what carriers use. But that would be a question to take a look at and to have a conversation with the ELD provider to make sure if that's something you need to be able to do, that you can switch that time. But it is always that, you know, it's the definition of day, and
Right.
depends on.
Is it the legal definition of day as well? And does that have anything to do with it?
No, because it is a defined term within Division 37 specifically.
A day is,
it's a defined term.
Right. So that is a legal definition of day.
Yes.
Because you see it elsewhere in other regulations and
so there's the thing in how things I learned during the drafting process, many things. If there's something that's defined in a particular division of the Motor Vehicle Act regulation, that definition applies within that whole division. There's also definitions that happen at the Motor Vehicle Act level that then apply for the whole of the Motor Vehicle Act. And then there's also something known as the Interpretation Act, which defines other things. And that's basically, if it's not defined in the reg or the act, it then goes back to the Interpretation Act, that it would then be the sort of the defining piece. But because it's specified in Division 37, it's that particular definition that applies, not sort of the more broad, which would generally say that a day is, a calendar day or a business day. In this case, it is very specifically the 24-hour period as defined by the carrier.
Excellent. Do we have anything more coming in, Eva?
Yes, so this question might actually interest more people. So Ken is asking if there are any government-supported rebates or support for costs associated with implementing necessary ELDs.
There aren't at this point. There's a fair variety of what's out there and what the costs are for the devices. And the prices have been coming down substantially from what they used to be with electronic recording devices. And part of that is the old versions of them had to be basically hardwired into the vehicle. There was no other option. ELDs, some of them are hardwired in, some of them literally, it's an app on your phone or tablet that you might already have in your vehicle for like GPS or those kind of things, and a Bluetooth dongle that plugs into the appropriate port in the vehicle. And so the equipment costs can be significantly less than they used to be. Lots of them do have a subscription fee because of sort of the monitoring pieces and the access that the carrier needs along the way. And the other piece that comes with that is that there's very specific things that these are the functions that an ELD has to do. But lots of those ELD suppliers also have things that are, well, I would say it's the would you like fries with that question, that could include, you know, being able to do your trip inspection reports on that same device as part of that. That could include all of that information then getting, you know, sent out to your maintenance department to, you know, for the sort of fleet management pieces. And so there can be a fair variety from ones that are fairly inexpensive to ones that are, you know, sort of massive fleet management systems that are all connected. And so that is a piece sort of as you're looking for them. There are definitely ones that are significantly less in cost that are, you know, in the scope of what is needed in industry in general is a reasonably low cost, but there aren't rebates and things currently available on that. I haven't heard of any discussions happening with that, but might be a question for the ARA to raise and ask. I don't know what Mike had said.
Thank you, Karen. And the next question is from Mike. He's asking if there will be some on paper or off paper exceptions. And he's referring to some kind of situations like if there is some extensive recovery and if all these rules would still apply or if there are some exceptions.
Yeah, so there are places that already exist within the regulation, and they're currently in 3711, and particularly 3711H is the current one that might be relevant. Nope, that's not a section in the new one. I know the numbers of yet. I know it's going to be. I know it's sub 1G, but because we've moved a few things around, but I don't remember the first part of that section number. It's the hazard of having both sets of section numbers partly in my brain. 3711H in the current reg is the one that exempts hours of service when for highway and public utility construction and maintenance. I've probably said that totally not quite the right way, but that highway maintenance is one of those pieces when it's on, under, or over the surface of the highway while at the work site, but not while traveling to and from the work site. And it's a discussion that we've been having about, you know, how much of, you know, when a road needs to get cleared because people have, you know, think about the Coquihalla or the Malahat or, you know, and those things where things have gotten blocked. That certainly, you know, the need to remove vehicles, that to me, that seems a lot like highway maintenance. And so we're taking a look at that to make sure that we can be, you know, sort of clear on that and what that means with the pieces about worksite and, you know, sort of how that plays out. But the other piece in relation to that is there are always the pieces in regards to emergency situations and adverse driving conditions. Some of those things still exist and will still exist in the new regulation as well. All of those, I would say, come with the reminder of what's currently in 3712 and what will in future be in 3706 about the need, you know, for everybody to be part of making sure we don't have drivers on the road when it would be likely to jeopardize the, you know, the health and well-being of those, because that's always the key.
Yeah, so it sounds, Karen, if the way the regulations are already drafted, you think they're pretty encompassing now of all those situations. It's just because they, you know, they're one-offs and how do they apply? It's just how to understand the regulations is basically what it is, rather than, well, we need to go and rewrite them.
Yeah. The other thing I would say with that is, you know, from a carrier end of things, if you're looking at your drivers, you know, if we were to come in and audit and we see, okay, you know, somebody was out of compliance with the hours of service, but you, as the carrier has made notes on that. They've followed up with the driver. They've looked at, you know, sort of followed whatever disciplinary policies are needed if there's a reason for that, or have noted and been like, oh, this is what was going on and this is why. We're looking at that point during audits to understand that carriers have done their due diligence, right? And we know that stuff happens out there on the road. We want to help make sure that carriers are doing what they can do to help make sure that people are making good choices and operating safely. And then when things happen, and somebody needs, is over hours, that the carrier has looked at that and is aware that that's happening, so that they can, take a look and go, okay, is there something that we could have done differently? Or is this yep, that's okay. And because those sort of pieces if an officer stopped them on roadside, they'll make those decisions about what they need to do at that point. During audit, we're then looking at that sort of broader picture about what a carrier is doing to help make sure. Oh, we seem to have lost Eva again.
We seem to have lost Eva, yeah.
So just,
we're just
sort of
about done anyways.
documenting those things is really the important piece from a carrier end.
Okay. I think lost Eva, and I don't see any more questions come up. So thank you, Karen. Very informative. There's lots to this. Oh, Eva has come back. I think, hi Eva, I think I didn't see any more questions, so I think we're just about ready to wrap up. Was there anything that just came in last minute that?
Yeah, there was one question from Dan, and I believe.
Okay, well, we have time for one more question then, so let's.
Okay, perfect. So I was just asking if these new regulations also affect those companies that operate on 24-hour on-call shifts, if it also affects the on-duty hours.
Yeah, so the reality is in the same way that they always have, because Division 37, the basic hours of service requirements in the, no more than 13 hours of driving time, no more than 14 on duty in a 16 elapsed, that part isn't changing. And so those things do still apply even when there's a 24-hour on-call shift. One of the things to look at is things like what the definitions are of on-duty time, and to see how those things fit. And I would say if there's questions and you're seeing places where that's causing an issue and you have concern about whether you're compliant, please be in contact so that we can take a look at it. My piece is always that we want to work with industry so that we can figure out how to make our roads safer. And there is no question that what the towing industry does is part of how we make our roads safer, right? We won't talk about how many times at various points I've needed tow trucks. Less since I've moved out here. That's a good sign. So, we understand that those things are important. And so if there's questions of that sort that are coming up and you're not sure how it works, please be in contact, because then we can take a look and see what, how we can navigate through that.
Okay. Well, it sounds like you want to hear that feedback. You want people to write in or email in and give those examples so that that we can, increase our understanding. It's just about time to wrap up. We were late a few minutes, so I do want to be fair to everybody. Eva, do we have time for one last question, Karen? 2 minutes?
My time is good.
Great. I don't know if anything else came in. I think that might have been it.
Yes, we actually got 3 more questions.
Okay, I don't know if we have time for that. It depends on the questions. Let's cap it at that. Okay, we'll try to answer these succinctly, but that's it. But you're always available anyways for afterwards. I'm sure some more questions will be coming in after people have had a time to digest this. It is a Friday afternoon, so.
It is. And they're good questions, so good job.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
okay,
we have a great audience today. So Michael is asking, do we need to apply the exception from CSVE for emergency or RCMP 24-hour call out?
So there isn't anything there to apply for an exemption on. What I would say is, and this might be a piece, Ken, for the, sort of as the association, to try to pull together some information about how that's working within the industry and where the issues are, so that we can sort of look at that more broadly with industry, and see what options there are and what, how we can work together on that one.
Yeah, so I think in this case scenario, police have called you, but you would have to deny the call because, well, sorry, I can't go out, right? So, okay. So there's sort of an understanding that police have to understand.
Yeah.
what, and I don't know if you've had any liaison or consultation or with them.
We haven't specifically on this issue, and I think it's one of those places that might be that there's, you know, as ELDs make everybody more aware of what the hours of service requirements are, to you know, when there's places that it doesn't fit, what are the options? Because there might be
Right.
things in the reg that give us some flexibility, but it's understanding what the issues are and, you know, working to partner together with all of the players, you know, to understand how we do that in a way that helps keep everybody safe and,
Right.
you know,
Okay.
gets everything happening that needs to.
Oh, okay. Next one, Eva.
One practical question from Paul. So if you get stuck in traffic and run out of hours and you have people in your truck, should you just drop them off or make them wait? That's the question.
So ultimately that doesn't change with an ELD than it does currently, right? There are, the hours are what they are, but there are pieces in there about adverse driving situations, and, you know, in emergency places, and then, you know, getting people to the, you know, to the next sort of the safe place to park. And so those, you know, those things still apply. They don't change with the introduction of ELDs because those are things that have always, you know, always been part of it.
Okay. Thank you. And the last question isn't really a question, it's more of a concern for small towing companies that they are operating 24/7 and they are servicing their community. So they are just worried, you know, how this is gonna affect them. So I don't know if you have some final words for these small companies.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to the same sort of piece in that, you know, the advent of ELDs doesn't change the basic hours of service rules. I think what it has done is highlight the places where the hours of service rules are a challenge for within this industry. And at the moment, the rules are as they exist. But I think it's also, you know, I knew there were associations that dealt with tow trucks. I didn't know who they were. Now I do. And we have already, Ken and Dave and I have already chatted a little bit about the, you know, the need to start having some of these conversations and figure out how we, you know, how we navigate that as we go forward, because we need tow trucks available on our road, and we need them available at weird times of the day that makes scheduling a challenge, particularly in areas where, you know, I live in Victoria, you know, there's lots. Well, except sometimes they still not, you know,
Right.
all of those pieces. So I think that's more, you know, that we'll continue to look at as we move forward.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I'm sure there'll be some continued discussion with this, but I think this webinar has been a good start anyways. It always starts with the education, and oftentimes people just get their questions answered. So I will be posting the PDF on the ARA website. That'll be probably in a few days. Sorry, somebody. I'm just getting feedback. Sorry. That will have the email at the end of the PowerPoint. Address any questions. It's probably best, I think, right now, rather than addressing them to me, address them directly to yourself, because they're just going to go to you anyways. I think after we compile a little bit of information, then we'll have a little greater understanding of the nuances, and then we can address those specific issues. And then, of course, there will be a recording of this webinar, and you can watch it all over again. Technical glitches at all. So Karen, I want to thank you for being here, and Dave for also helping me with this event. And of course, Eva, editor and publisher of Tow Canada. Thank you for being here. And maybe there's an article in Tow Canada for this, don't you think?
Yes, it's a very interesting topic. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Definitely.
Another way we can get this information out. So I want to thank you and all our guests for attending and for all the questions, and enjoy your Friday afternoon.
Thanks all.
Have a good day.